Coming up on Avalon Woodworks, we show you how we add drawers and 5-piece shaker-style doors to finish out our kitchen pantry cabinet build. Hello and welcome to part 2 of this kitchen pantry cabinet build. On our last video, we showed you how we built the boxes and installed them into this kitchen. So this time we're going to show you how we do the drawers and doors. The first step for me here is to go ahead and install our favorite Blum undermount drawer slides. I do this first so that I can take measurements off of the width and make sure that our drawer boxes are going to fit exactly. If you're going to have your boxes pre-made, you can already do the math ahead of time, but in this case, I was building it on site, so this wasn't a problem for me. So one thing you can't see, and I kind of apologize for that, is there's already a board on each side of the back of the cabinet where I've attached our rear mounting brackets. So all I have to do is slot the back of these drawer slides into those brackets and then screw them into the face frames on the front. Now that our brackets are mounted and we've taken all of our measurements, we can go ahead and start making our drawer boxes. For these, I used a 1/2-inch prefinished birch plywood just to save money and to do this a little bit faster. That being said, you can always make them out of solid material with some dovetails and make them pretty fancy, but we're not like that. So we just did a simple, strong construction here. These particular drawers are going to finish at 21 inches deep, 20 inches wide, and 6 inches tall. Here you can see me laying out parts just to visualize how everything's going to fit together before we cut our dados. While we are building these boxes as fast as possible, we still want to make sure that they're plenty strong for our purposes. So we're actually going to be cutting a dado or a slot that's going to fit our 1/2-inch bottom to our drawers. So these things should be able to take plenty of weight. To do that, I'm using something called a dado stack, which is actually a stack of blades that go into your table saw. And these particular ones, it's probably worth noting, I don't even think are legal in Europe. So this is kind of an American-only thing for our overseas watchers. Now, I'm just using a set of aluminum setup blocks to make sure that our blade height and then our width from the fence are exactly where we need them so that everything fits into our drawer boxes perfectly. After setting up our blade height and width, it's always smart to go ahead and do a test cut on a scrap piece just to make sure that everything's going to fit with your drawer bottoms the way that they need to. If everything works properly, it should be a nice tight fit without being too tight so that you're having to force it on. And if we did our job right, it should look something like this, so there's no gaps, but everything goes together nicely. Once we're happy with the setup, it's time to go ahead and cut the slots into all of our drawer pieces for each side except for the back, because that winds up being just a little bit different with the undermount construction that we're doing. So for some crazy reason, I have this fear that I'm going to get to the end of a project and be missing some parts or miscounted somewhere. So one of the things that I always like to do at the end of a step is organize everything and double check our counts. In this stack, you may even see that I cut some extra parts just to make sure that if something goes wrong or if something gets split, that our butts are still covered. So the last step before assembly is one of my all-time favorite steps called edge banding. Now, if you don't know what edge banding is, this is basically a way to cover up the unfinished ends on your drawer boxes. A lot of your furniture, especially anything you buy from IKEA, is actually going to have edge banding applied just to cover up the particle board or plywood or whatever the material is made of. This particular edge banding is actually real birch veneer, which is just birch that's sliced really thin and then has glue pre-applied on the back. So all we have to do is cut it, clamp it into place, and then use an iron to heat up the glue and then roll it on, and it becomes a permanent part of the piece. Now the excess will get trimmed off at a later stage, but you can already see how much better that plywood edge looks. Now, even though there aren't that many drawer boxes, this is still something that takes about an hour or so. So you can see I have a little assembly line set up here to try to make this as quick and easy as possible. But needless to say, I'm going to be investing in an edge banding machine very soon. And much later, it's time to go ahead and trim off that excess edge banding. To make this quick, I'm going to be using a flush trim bit on my router. Basically, it's just a bit that has straight knives and uses a bearing to follow the edges and just cuts right up to the plywood without actually cutting the plywood itself. This process is pretty messy and sends little bits everywhere, so you can also see that I'm wearing a mask so I don't have to breathe all that stuff in. Now, even though the bit itself has a bearing that should stop us from damaging the workpiece, we still want to take our time so that we don't accidentally gouge the wood and have to start all over, because that would suck. Once we've routed off all the excess, I like to use a sanding block just to clean up all the edges, give them a little bit of a round over, and just make sure everything's nice to the touch and ready for assembly. And if we did our job well, you should just have a nice finished edge, and our workpiece should just look like one solid piece of birch. Now that all of our pieces are finished, it's time to actually assemble our drawer boxes. Here I'm going to do one side at a time, just so I can make sure that everything is squared and all of our joints are nice and tight. Now, one thing to note if you ever decide to do this yourself is that most wood glues won't actually stick to a pre-finished surface like we're using. So instead I'm using a product called Rue Glue, which it's not super strong, but it will stick finished surfaces together. Once it's glued, I'm going to go ahead and use some brad nails just to hold everything together. But really the dado slot and the glue are going to be doing the majority of the work here. Now, while it seems like a small step, it's really important to get off all the excess glue, especially out of the joints. If you give the glue a chance to dry, it just becomes a pain in the butt to try to get out later, especially without scratching that pre-finished surface. So this little step goes a long way. Now, after repeating that step for all four sides, here we are attaching the back. Now, you'll notice the back piece does not go all the way down. That actually gives us room for our runners on our undermount drawer slides, which you should see later. But again, same idea. We just put some glue around the edges, and then we're using brad nails to hold it in place while everything dries. Now that everything is assembled, I like to leave them in these right angle clamps just to make sure that everything stays square while it dries. Now, while our drawer boxes are drying, we set those aside, and it's time to go ahead and prep the panels that are going to be the center of our shaker doors for our cabinets. Here, I'm actually having to remove the clear coat. It's actually a really hard UV cured coating. And the reason for that is much like the glue we were trying to use earlier, is paint won't stick to it. And so if you don't go through this step, your finish is not going to last very long. So this is really a little tedious, but really important. Now that our door panels are prepped, the next thing we have to do is cut a rabbet off of the ends, which is basically just using a dado stack like we did before, but I'm only removing about half of the thickness of the material so that we have a thin slot to go into our door rails you'll see later. The safest way to do this is to use a sacrificial fence, which is basically just a piece of wood that you clamp onto your fence. In this case, I'm trying not to damage my brand new table saw. But it lets the blade go right up to the edge so that you don't have to go back and make multiple passes. And as with most things in cabinet making, we rinse and repeat until we have done the same for all of our door panels. Here you can see the rabbet that's been cut around the outside, leaving us with a 1/4 inch of material that's going to slot into our door rails and stiles that we're just about to make. For the rails and stiles on our doors, we're going to be using 3/4 inch thick poplar hardwood that's been ripped into roughly 2-inch strips. Here, I'm actually cutting our profiles using a machine called a shaper, which uses special bits that not only cut the slot, but also leave a nice 20-degree bevel that'll look nice whenever we assemble the door. Here you can see that having the right tool for the job makes this so much faster and more uniform. Here, all of our door rails and stiles are cut and are ready for the next step, which is coping. Now, the last step before we can assemble our doors is a process called coping. Basically, what we're doing is we're using another bit to cut a tongue or a tenon that's going to fit into the slots of our door stiles, which you'll see later. But it's going to make everything fit together nicely and be nice and strong when we add some glue. Now, one thing you may have noticed is because the wood we're using is so soft, we're getting a little bit of fuzz on the ends. That's not a huge deal. That'll just get sanded off before we do our final door assembly. Now here, for the first time, you get to see how all of our door pieces go together to make a shaker door. Our rails, which are the short pieces, and our stiles, which are the long pieces, lock in together and kind of encapsulate that center panel while still allowing it to move. A good reason for this is because hardwoods like to expand and contract as they get hot and cold and as our humidity changes. So we want to make sure that they have room to move while still letting that center panel float. You may have also noticed that we left our stiles long. I'll show you why we did that in a bit. Once the doors have been dry fit and we're happy with our clearances, it's time to go ahead and add some wood glue to make the doors permanent. Now here, you'll notice I'm only adding glue where the rails and stiles are going to meet, where the tenon goes into the slots. The reason for that is because we don't want to get glue around the center panel or it won't be able to float, which may cause some issues if those rails and stiles ever expand and contract, which they will. Now you'll notice I'm taking my time here to make sure everything's perfect before I put things into clamps. The reason for that is once this glue dries, you really can't get the doors back apart without destroying them, and so you have to start over. So this is definitely something you want to take your time doing. Also, I'm using parallel clamps, which have a bar in the bottom to make sure that the door stays flat, and then pressure is applied as evenly as possible. If you over tighten, what can actually happen is the stiles will kind of fold up, and your door gets a bit of a bow to it. Now, once everything's been glued up, this is the last chance you get to check for square. So once again, we're going to pull out and make sure that our corners are 90s. Otherwise, we're going to have to toss these doors and start over. Once we're happy with our fitment and alignment, we'll set these doors aside and let them dry. So here I'm actually finishing one of our drawer fronts. This is built the exact same way as the doors, so you didn't miss anything. One of the last steps on both the drawer fronts and the doors will be to go through and just fill in any minute cracks with wood filler. This is something we can do because the doors are going to be painted. Obviously, on a stained door, you don't want to see that wood filler. That wouldn't be an option. And finally, all of our doors and drawer fronts are assembled, filled, and just about ready for paint. The only thing missing is everyone's favorite activity, sanding. Now, surely you enjoy sanding as much as I do, but for the rest of our viewers, I went ahead and condensed what was actually several hours of prep work into just a quick little time lapse before we can get into painting. You're welcome. Now that everything's built, it's time to make things look pretty. Unfortunately, I lost some footage here, so you're just seeing me apply the top coat, but essentially the process is the same. I like to use 2 coats of primer and then at least 1 coat of finish color, with some sanding in between, just to give us a nice durable finish. And here's where all that prep work we did earlier pays off. You can just see how smoothly that nice sage green laid down and gave us a nice factory finish. Once the paint has had a day or two to cure, it's time to go ahead and add our hardware. Here I'm using a jig to make this a little bit more accurate and faster, but you could do this really just by measuring if you wanted to. One thing to note, I am using a plywood backer board just to keep the back of the holes from blasting out whenever we drill. One of the last things we have to do before we can mount our doors onto our cabinets is to go ahead and cut the holes for our hinges. Here, I'm using a special jig that has a 35mm bit that actually stops it from cutting too deep and will be just at the right depth for our hinges. And last but not least, we need to screw our hinges onto our doors so that they can be mounted. Here, I'm just using a level as a straight edge to make sure that our hinges stay aligned as I'm screwing them in, and make sure that everything stays nice and tight. And the very last thing we're doing here is just clipping on our plates. These are the pieces that are going to screw onto the face frames that actually allow our doors to attach to our cabinets. And with that, we should pretty much be done. I did complete our drawers off camera and slid them into place onto the drawer slides we mounted earlier. And now you can see we have a nice finished product with plenty of pantry storage for our home. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments and stay tuned for our next project. We have big plans for this house, so there'll be plenty more to come.